It began on a coastal bridge at dawn when the ocean pulled back in silence. The kind of silence that only comes before something terrible remembers how big it is. A man stood frozen on steel slick with seawater, his German Shepherd K9 braced beside him, paws sliding as the ground trembled. Out on the bridge, an elderly couple was trapped inside a stalled car, waves rising fast enough to steal the horizon. The woman clutched her husband's arm, gasping as each surge slammed the pillars below. The same sound, the same helpless rhythm that once took someone they loved from the sea. "Stay with me," the man whispered, again and again, as if love alone could anchor them while the bridge began to tear itself apart. The first wave hit like a wall. Metal screamed, concrete cracked, and before anyone could stop him, the man ran back toward the collapsing span, his K9 lunging ahead, teeth locked on a rescue line, eyes burning with duty older than fear. They pulled the couple free just seconds before the bridge gave way, steel folding into water, the ocean swallowing everything it touched. By nightfall, the couple was alive. By morning, the man had lost his job, punished for choosing lives over procedure, courage over compliance. But destiny has a way of circling back. And when the two souls he saved return with the truth, what began as a disaster at sea becomes a reckoning that changes the entire town. So let me ask you, when the water is rising, the ground is breaking, and there's no time left to be careful, what would you have done? And before we begin, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. The morning arrived the way it always did along the Oregon coast, quiet, pale, and deceptively gentle. Low clouds drifted above the water like tired ghosts, and the Pacific breathed in long, even waves against the rocks. The town of Greyhaven sat half awake behind the dunes, a scattering of weathered houses, bait shops, and cafes that smelled of coffee and salt. Fishing boats rocked lazily in the harbor. Gulls cried, not in warning, but in habit. Nothing about the sky suggested danger. Nothing about the sea looked angry. And that was the problem. Ethan Walker stood on the east side of Bayline Bridge, clipboard tucked under his arm, boots planted on damp steel. He was 43 years old, tall without being imposing, built lean and functional rather than broad. The kind of body shaped by years of climbing ladders, hauling equipment, and standing for long hours in bad weather. His dark hair was cut short and already threaded with gray at the temples. His face carried the quiet lines of a man who listened more than he spoke, with steady hazel eyes that rarely stopped measuring distance, stress, and consequence. He wore a high-visibility jacket over a faded work sweater, the sleeves rolled back despite the chill, not because he was immune to cold, but because discomfort was familiar, and familiarity felt safer than comfort. Ethan was a civil engineer by trade. Bridges, specifically. Steel, load paths, failure points. He was also a man who hadn't fully forgiven himself. This inspection was supposed to be routine. A short-term contract from the county, one of those jobs they gave to experienced hands without asking too many questions. Bayline Bridge was old, nearly 60 years. A steel and concrete span that arched over the mouth of the bay, connecting Greyhaven to the inland highway. It had passed its last review. Barely. Ethan crouched, running gloved fingers along a seam where rust bloomed beneath peeling paint. He noted it on his clipboard, neat handwriting, precise language, surface corrosion, monitor, no immediate structural concern. That phrase, no immediate concern, had followed him for years. Beside him stood Bruno. Bruno was a German Shepherd K9, 6 years old, male, large and powerfully built without excess bulk. His sable coat was thick and well kept, darkening along the spine, lighter tan along his chest and legs. A faint scar traced the edge of his right ear, the souvenir of a collapsed building during a search and rescue operation 3 winters earlier. His eyes were amber, intelligent, and unsettlingly alert. Bruno wore a working harness, black with reflective strips, though he hadn't officially been on duty in over a year. A torn ligament in his hind leg had ended his formal service early. Too risky, the department had said. Too unpredictable. Ethan disagreed. Bruno stood not like a pet, but like a sentinel, head high, ears forward. Weight balanced, as if the bridge itself were something that might move. Most people in town knew them as a pair, the quiet engineer and the serious dog. They didn't ask questions. The bridge hummed faintly beneath Ethan's boots as a truck passed. Normal vibration, acceptable range. He exhaled slowly and straightened, glancing toward the water. The tide was wrong. Not dramatic, not obvious, just enough that his instincts, honed, unwanted, inherited from past mistakes, stirred. The water near the pylon seemed to hesitate, as if deciding something. Bruno felt it first. The dog stiffened, muscles locking beneath his fur, his head turned sharply toward the ocean, nostrils flaring. A low sound vibrated in his chest. Not a bark, not a growl, but something older. A warning meant for those who understood. Ethan frowned. "What is it, boy?" Bruno didn't look at him. Instead, the dog took 3 deliberate steps forward, then stopped, squarely blocking the path toward the center span of the bridge. His body formed a barrier, tail low, ears rigid. He let out a short, sharp howl, one note, cut clean. Ethan's pulse quickened. Bruno had been trained to detect changes most humans ignored. Subtle ground vibration, pressure shifts, structural resonance. During his service, he'd alerted handlers seconds before aftershocks, before gas line ruptures, before secondary collapses. "Easy," Ethan murmured, though his voice lacked conviction. He followed Bruno's gaze to the horizon. The sea was pulling back, slowly, quietly, too quietly. Greyhaven had sirens. Everyone knew that. They tested them twice a year. Annoying, unnecessary drills, most residents thought. Tourists complained. Shop owners rolled their eyes. The last real tsunami had been decades ago. That kind of thing doesn't happen here, people said. Ethan had heard those words before, in another town. Over another bridge. Years earlier, he had signed off on a structure upriver in California. The collapse came after record rainfall. Not during, not immediately. A delayed failure. Investigations found no direct negligence. The reports cleared his name. The people did not. No one had died, but several were injured. Careers ended. Reputations evaporated. Ethan left shortly after. He hadn't stopped building bridges, but he had stopped trusting silence. Bruno's paws shifted, claws scraping lightly on steel. Then finally, the siren wailed, not loud at first, almost uncertain, a rising mechanical cry that cut through the coastal calm and shattered it. Ethan checked his watch, late, not by much, maybe 2-3 minutes, but in disasters, minutes weren't numbers, they were lives. A gull exploded into flight from the railing. In the distance, a car horn blared. Someone shouted. Bruno barked once, sharp and commanding, then looked back at Ethan as if to say, "Now." Ethan swallowed, heart hammering, and stepped back from the bridge's edge. The ocean far below surged forward, and the morning that had begun in peace tilted, quietly, decisively toward catastrophe. The siren was still echoing when the water arrived, not as a wall, at least not yet, but as a sudden, violent decision. The Pacific surged back into the bay with a force that felt personal, slamming into the mouth of the inlet and racing inward as if it had been waiting for permission. The first wave split around the pylons of Bayline Bridge and struck them from both sides, sending a shudder through the steel that traveled straight up into Ethan Walker's boots. He staggered, catching himself on the railing as cold spray burst over the deck, the air filled with the smell of salt and rust. Below, the water churned into a thick, foaming mass, no longer rhythmic, no longer patient. It was moving fast now, too fast. "Back!" someone shouted from the shore. Ethan turned instinctively, pulling Bruno with him. But the eastern approach was already disappearing beneath a racing sheet of gray water. The western side wasn't better. Another surge rolled in, flooding the road in a matter of seconds, swallowing the painted lines and the shallow shoulder as if they had never existed. They were cut off. Ethan's mind snapped into a hard, narrow focus. He took in distances, angles, options, and found none that didn't end badly. The bridge deck slicked over as water streamed across it. The steel vibrated again, deeper this time, like something enormous had struck it from below. Bruno planted himself at Ethan's side. The dog lowered his center of gravity, muscles bunching, paws splayed for traction. When Ethan slipped, Bruno pressed his shoulder into Ethan's thigh without hesitation, a solid, living brace that kept him upright. Ethan felt the strength there, warm, steady, utterly unafraid. "Good," Ethan breathed. "Good boy." Another sound cut through the chaos, a horn, blaring and frantic. Ethan followed it with his eyes and saw the car. It was a silver sedan stopped near the center span, angled awkwardly as water pushed against its tires. The driver had likely tried to turn around when the sirens began, only to lose traction on the wet steel. Now the car rocked as the bridge trembled, headlights flashing erratically through the spray. "There's someone there," Ethan said, though Bruno was already moving. They reached the car as another wave struck the pylons, sending a violent jolt through the structure. The vehicle lurched, its rear wheels lifting slightly before slamming back down. Inside were two figures. The driver was an older man in his 70s, tall even while seated, with broad shoulders that spoke of a life spent working with his hands. His white hair was cut short and neat, though sweat had plastered it to his forehead. His jaw was strong, set in a way that suggested stubbornness more than calm. This was Henry Collins. Henry's hands shook on the steering wheel, but his posture was rigid, as if he believed that sitting straight might somehow keep the bridge from failing beneath him. His eyes, sharp gray-blue, flicked between the water and Ethan with quick, assessing movements. In the passenger seat sat Margaret Collins, his wife. She was smaller, slighter, her frame narrow beneath a heavy coat. Her silver hair was pulled back into a low bun that had begun to loosen, thin strands clinging to her cheeks. Her face was pale, and her breathing came in shallow, uneven pulls. One hand clutched her chest through the fabric of her coat. The other was locked tightly around Henry's forearm. Margaret's eyes were wide, glassy with fear. Ethan leaned toward the driver's window, raising his voice over the roar of the water. "Can you move the car?" Henry shook his head once. "Tires won't grip," he said. His voice was deep, steady, but there was strain under it. "She's not doing well." Margaret made a small, broken sound and pressed her forehead against the window. The bridge shook again, harder this time, and she gasped sharply, fingers digging into Henry's sleeve. Ethan's gaze dropped to the underside of the bridge, where the water slammed repeatedly against the concrete supports. He felt the vibration through his bones. This wasn't just flooding. This was force mass multiplied by speed, hammering at structures never designed for this kind of abuse. "How long?" Henry asked, following Ethan's eyes. Ethan hesitated. He hated lying. He hated false reassurance more. "I don't know," he said, "but we need to get you out of the car." Henry nodded, then paused. "I worked on this bridge," he said abruptly. Ethan looked back at him. 20 years ago," Henry continued, almost shouting now as another surge rocked the car. "I was a welder, part of a maintenance crew. We reinforced some joints on the center span stress fractures. Nothing major, or so they said." Something cold slid into place inside Ethan's chest. "What kind of joints?" Ethan asked. Henry glanced toward the water, then back. "Lower gusset plates near the central pylons. Corrosion was worse than the report claimed. We patched what we were told to patch." Ethan didn't need more. His mind mapped it instantly. The load paths, the weak points, the places where repeated impacts could turn old compromises into sudden failures. "Margaret," Ethan said, turning toward her, "I'm going to open the door. When I do, I need you to stay with me. Can you do that?" Margaret nodded too quickly. Her lips trembled. I have a heart condition," she whispered. "It's not bad usually, but the shaking—" "I know," Ethan said, softer now. "Just breathe with me. Slow." Bruno moved closer, placing his body between Margaret's door and the open edge of the bridge. The dog's stance was deliberate, protective. He leaned slightly into the car, his weight countering the push of the wind and water. When Margaret's eyes flicked toward him, something in her expression shifted, not relief exactly, but recognition, as if some part of her understood that this animal was not chaos. Ethan reached for the door handle. It opened on the first pull. The moment the seal broke, water surged around their ankles. Margaret cried out, clutching Ethan's sleeve. He felt the tremor in her grip, fear layered over a body already under strain. "That's it," he said. "Easy. One step." Henry unbuckled his seatbelt with shaking fingers, but didn't move right away. He looked past Ethan, out toward the ends of the bridge now lost beneath the flood. "People don't listen to warnings anymore," Henry said. It wasn't an accusation. It was an observation, tired and heavy. "They think the ocean is decoration." Ethan met his eyes. "They will today." Another wave hit. The bridge groaned, an awful metallic sound that seemed to rise from the structure itself. Ethan felt Bruno push harder into his leg as the deck slicked further, his boots sliding despite the tread. Bruno adjusted instantly, shifting his weight. anchoring Ethan in place with practiced precision. The dog's breathing was steady, controlled, even as the world around them dissolved into noise and motion. Ethan helped Margaret out of the car, guiding her carefully, keeping her close to the inside railing. She stumbled once, and Bruno pressed his flank against her calf, absorbing the impact before she could fall. Her hand brushed his fur, fingers sinking in instinctively. "Thank you," she whispered to the dog, voice barely audible. Henry followed, slower, his movements stiff. He winced as another tremor ran through the bridge. "If that center joint goes," he said under his breath, "this span won't fail all at once." Ethan swallowed. "How long?" Henry shook his head. "Minutes, if we're lucky." The water continued to rise, racing across the deck, slamming into the guardrails. Somewhere in the distance, something broke, a sharp crack that vanished beneath the roar. They stood together on the trembling bridge, a man burdened by old failures, a dog built for impossible steadiness, and a couple whose lives had narrowed suddenly to the space between waves. The ocean surged again, higher than before, and this time the bridge answered with a sound that made Ethan's blood run cold. The second wave did not arrive like the first. There was no hesitation this time, no deceptive pause. The water came fast and heavy, surging into the bay with a deep, thunderous force that struck the bridge head-on. The impact was violent enough to knock the breath from Ethan's chest. Steel screamed, concrete groaned. Somewhere beneath them, something fundamental gave way. A sharp, metallic crack split the air. Ethan turned just in time to see it happen. One of the bridge's outer spans, an older steel segment near the western side, buckled under the combined pressure of water and stress. The deck twisted, rails snapping like brittle bones, and then the entire section collapsed downward, vanishing into the churning gray below with a roar that drowned out every other sound. The bridge didn't just shake, it recoiled. Margaret screamed, a raw, panicked sound torn from her chest. Her knees gave out, and Ethan caught her just as the deck lurched again. Henry wrapped an arm around her shoulders, holding her upright through sheer will. "That's it," Henry said hoarsely. "That was one of the load-sharing spans." Ethan didn't answer right away. His mind was already racing ahead, calculating in brutal clarity. He pictured the bridge as a system, not a structure forces redistributed, stresses migrating to joints never meant to carry them alone. 15 minutes, maybe 20. If the center span held, if nothing else failed first. The bridge was dying, not all at once, but piece by piece, like an animal whose organs were shutting down one by one. Bruno barked sharply, then limped a step as the deck jolted again. Ethan noticed it then, the way Bruno favored his right hind leg, the slight hitch in his movement that had grown more pronounced since the waves began. The old injury, aggravated by strain and slippery footing. "You're hurt," Ethan muttered. Bruno ignored him, eyes locked on Margaret. She had slumped against Henry now, breathing shallow and rapid, her face drained of color. Her fingers clawed weakly at Henry's jacket, searching for something solid in a world that had lost all reliability. "I can't," she whispered. "I can't feel my hands." Henry's jaw clenched. "Maggie, look at me. Stay with me." But her eyes were drifting, unfocused, panic folding inward on itself. Ethan had seen this before, not just fear, but the body turning against itself, heart and breath falling out of rhythm under stress. Bruno moved before Ethan could give the command. The dog turned back toward the car they had just exited, the silver sedan now half submerged, water sloshing around its doors. Without hesitation, Bruno stepped onto the slick metal, then jumped down into the back seat through the open door. The landing wasn't clean. Bruno's injured leg buckled slightly and he let out a low grunt of pain, but he stayed upright. He moved with deliberate care now, each motion controlled, economical. Inside the car, the noise of the storm dulled slightly, replaced by the claustrophobic drum of water battering metal. Margaret's head snapped toward the sound. Bruno climbed carefully onto the seat beside her and pressed his body against her legs, anchoring her. His chest rose and fell in slow, steady breaths, exaggerated on purpose. He nudged her hand gently with his nose, then placed it against his thick fur. Margaret gasped, startled, and then clung to him. "Oh," she breathed, voice breaking. "Oh, you're real." Bruno met her gaze, amber eyes calm, unblinking. He let out a soft, rhythmic huff, a grounding sound he had been trained to use on survivors trapped under rubble, people teetering on the edge of shock. Ethan felt something twist painfully in his chest. The dog knew what to do. Outside the car, Ethan clipped his safety harness to a length of old maintenance cable bolted into the bridge deck. It wasn't ideal weathered, never meant for rescue, but it was something. The cable hummed under tension as another wave slammed into the pylons. Ethan reached for his radio. "Bayline Bridge Inspection Team, this is Walker," he said, forcing his voice steady. "We have civilians trapped on the center span. Partial collapse. Request immediate response." Static answered him. He adjusted the frequency, tried again. Nothing. The radio crackled weakly, then went dead. "No signal," Ethan muttered. Henry saw his expression and understood immediately. "No one's coming," he said. "Not in time," Ethan replied. The truth settled between them, heavy and cold. Ethan glanced toward the far end of the bridge, where the remaining spans still stood shaking, stressed but intact for now. If he moved fast, clipped in, he could make it. The cable would hold long enough for one person, maybe two, if he was lucky. He thought of the other bridge, years ago. The one he'd signed off on, then left early that day because his daughter had been sick, because life had demanded his attention somewhere else. The call had come hours later. Structural failure, injuries, investigation pending. He'd told himself he couldn't have changed anything. But the doubt had never left. Ethan looked at Henry, at Margaret clutching Bruno's fur, at the dog himself standing in rising water, injured leg trembling with effort. Stay and fight the impossible. Or leave, while leaving was still an option. Ethan closed his eyes for half a second, feeling the bridge shudder beneath him, feeling the weight of every choice he'd ever regretted. "No," he said aloud. Henry looked up sharply. "What?" "I'm not leaving," Ethan said. He tightened his grip on the cable, testing it once more. "Not this time." Another crack echoed through the structure closer now, louder. Bruno barked once from inside the car, sharp and urgent, as if answering. The bridge groaned again, and the water rose higher around the sinking vehicle. Time was no longer measured in minutes. It was measured in breaths. Ethan did not announce the decision. He simply began to move. The bridge shuddered beneath them again, a deep, uneven tremor that ran through steel and bone alike. Water surged higher, slapping against the sides of the car, climbing fast enough that it no longer felt like a wave but a rising floor. The air was thick with salt and the metallic tang of stressed iron. Ethan unclipped the extra length of industrial safety line from his harness. It was old but intact, rated for far more weight than any of them carried when anchored properly. He worked quickly, hands steady despite the chaos, looping the line around Bruno's harness first. Bruno did not resist. The German shepherd stood knee-deep in water beside the open car door, chest broad and braced, amber eyes never leaving Margaret. His breathing was controlled, his injured hind leg trembling faintly but holding. When Ethan tightened the knot, Bruno leaned forward instinctively, testing the tension like a professional climber testing rope. "Stay," Ethan said quietly. Bruno's ears flicked once. He stayed. Ethan then secured the line around Margaret's torso, just beneath her arms, careful not to constrict her breathing. Up close, he could see how pale she'd become, the faint sheen of sweat on her forehead despite the cold. She looked older now, more fragile, as if the storm were peeling years away in seconds. Margaret's eyes followed Ethan's hands. "What about Henry?" she asked, voice thin. Ethan didn't answer immediately. He finished the knot, checked it twice, then looked at her. "He's next." Henry stood a few feet away, gripping the railing, water swirling around his calves. Even now, soaked and shaking, he held himself like a man who had spent a lifetime believing responsibility was something you carried quietly. His coat hung heavy on his shoulders, dark with water, his hands raw and red from gripping cold steel. Henry met Ethan's gaze and nodded once. "I know what you're doing," he said, "and I know what it costs." Another crack echoed through the bridge, louder than before. Somewhere beneath them, concrete fractured. The deck dipped a fraction of an inch, barely visible, but unmistakable to someone like Ethan. There was no more time for careful sequencing. Ethan clipped Margaret's line into the overhead cable and gave it a hard tug. Bruno stepped closer to her immediately, positioning his body between Margaret and the open edge. The water surged again, higher, trying to pull her legs out from under her. Bruno reacted instantly. He clamped his jaws around the line just above Margaret's harness and dug his paws into the slick steel. His neck muscles flexed, tendons standing out beneath wet fur, as he leaned back with his full weight. The dog became an anchor, living, breathing, unyielding. Margaret cried out once as the water yanked at her coat, then steadied when the line held. Her hand found Bruno's shoulder, fingers sinking into his fur. "I've got you," she whispered, not sure if she meant to the dog or herself. Ethan turned away before the moment could root him in place. Henry was still inside the car. The sedan had shifted with the rising water, nose angled slightly downward now, the rear lifting and settling with each surge. The driver's door was jammed against twisted metal, warped just enough to resist every pull. Ethan clipped himself into a separate line, anchoring it to the same cable, then lowered himself carefully toward the car. The bridge deck near the center span was visibly cracked now, fissures snaking through the concrete like veins beneath thinning skin. As he descended, Henry leaned closer through the open window. "Before you do this," he said, voice raised over the roar, "you should know something." Ethan paused, one boot braced against the cracked deck. Henry swallowed, water splashed against the door, soaking his sleeves. "We knew," he said, "back then, about the corrosion, about the joint near the central pylons." Ethan's jaw tightened. "I saw the reports," Henry continued. "They were softened. Language changed, risks minimized. We all knew why." His mouth twisted bitterly. Jobs were scarce. Anyone who pushed too hard got labeled difficult, or worse. The confession hung heavy between them. "I told myself it wasn't my responsibility," Henry said, "that engineers higher up would catch it, that the system would correct itself." Another tremor rocked the bridge, forcing Ethan to grab the door frame to steady himself. "And now?" Ethan asked. Henry met his eyes. "Now I know silence is just another kind of failure." Ethan felt something inside him settle, not relief, not forgiveness, but understanding. He had spent years carrying a private version of the same guilt, believing responsibility was personal when it was in truth shared and diluted until no one felt it clearly enough to act. "The system didn't fail," Ethan said quietly. "People did. Together." Henry nodded, eyes wet, then looked past Ethan toward Margaret and Bruno. "Get her out first." Ethan didn't argue. He wedged his shoulder against the door and shoved. The metal screamed, bending slowly, stubbornly, until finally the latch gave with a sharp snap. The door swung open and water poured in. Henry gasped as the cold hit his legs, but he didn't panic. He braced himself, letting Ethan guide him forward. Above them, the sky darkened. The third wave was coming. Ethan felt it before he saw it, a pressure change, a deep vibration that traveled up through the pylons and into the fractured deck. The water around the bridge began to pull back again, fast and wrong. Bruno growled low, still biting down on the line, body shaking with effort. "Hold!" Ethan shouted, more to himself than anyone else. The wave struck with catastrophic force. Water exploded upward, slamming into the bridge supports from below, tearing at them with a violence that felt deliberate. One of the remaining pylons cracked, the sound like a tree splitting under ice. The bridge lurched, tilting just enough that Ethan slammed into the car door, ribs catching hard. Margaret screamed as the line went taut, her feet lifting off the deck for a terrifying second. Bruno dug in harder, teeth locked, claws scraping sparks from steel. His injured leg slipped, then caught again, muscles screaming but holding. Ethan hauled Henry up and out of the car just as the rear end dropped another foot. The sedan twisted violently, metal tearing free, and then it was gone, ripped from the bridge and swallowed by the water below. Henry clung to Ethan, coughing, shock finally breaking through his composure. "Move!" Ethan yelled. They scrambled upward together, Ethan pulling, Henry pushing, the safety line humming under the sudden load. Above them, Bruno held fast, refusing to yield even as the bridge shook itself apart piece by piece. For a brief, suspended moment, everything balanced on the strength of a rope, a dog's jaw, and a choice that could no longer be undone. The failure came without ceremony. No warning siren, no dramatic pause, just a final, brutal sound as the remaining strength of Bayline Bridge surrendered. The central span tore free with a grinding howl of metal, the deck dropping away beneath Ethan's boots as if the earth itself had decided to let go. The world tipped. Ethan felt weight vanish, then return all at once as the safety line snapped tight and flung him sideways. The impact slammed the air from his lungs. Steel flashed past his vision-twisted beams, cables whipping loose before everything dissolved into spray and noise. He hit hanging steel, not water, A jagged lattice of torn girders remained, suspended at an impossible angle, half attached to a single stubborn pylon that refused to fail quietly. Ethan crashed onto it hard, ribs screaming, hands scraping raw against rusted metal as he fought to keep his grip. Below him, the ocean raged. Above him, the bridge no longer existed. Bruno landed seconds later. The dog's body struck the steel with a dull thud, his harness catching on a bent crossbeam. He yelped once, a sharp, involuntary sound, then went silent, teeth bared, muscles locking as he fought gravity with everything he had left. Water surged upward, slamming into the hanging steel, soaking them both in freezing sheets. Ethan twisted, searching. "Bruno!" The German shepherd was still there, barely. His injured hind leg dangled uselessly, trembling violently, but his forepaws were planted, claws hooked into metal seams. His chest heaved with each breath, foam flecking his muzzle as he struggled to pull air between waves. Margaret screamed above them. Ethan looked up. The safety line had held. Margaret and Henry were suspended several feet higher, tangled in cables and debris, water lashing around their legs. Margaret's face was ashen, lips tinged blue, her body slackening even as the line kept her from being dragged under. Henry clung to her, one arm wrapped around her shoulders, the other locked around a cable with white-knuckled desperation. His voice was hoarse, nearly gone. "She's not breathing right." Ethan forced himself upright, pain screaming from his ribs. He crawled along the hanging steel inch by inch, fighting the pull of the water, every movement a negotiation with gravity. Bruno growled low, shifting to follow despite the obvious agony in his leg. "Stay," Ethan rasped. Bruno ignored him. Another wave struck, higher than the last. Water engulfed Ethan's head, slamming him against the steel until stars burst behind his eyes. He tasted blood. When the water receded, he gasped, choking, hands still miraculously holding. The bridge's remains groaned again, a deep, ominous sound that vibrated through the steel beneath them. The last pylon was weakening. Ethan clipped his harness into a closer cable, then reached Margaret. Up close, he could see the telltale signs, her shallow, irregular breathing, the tremor in her jaw, the faint flutter at her neck. "Margaret," he said, loud and clear, "look at me." Her eyes flickered, unfocused. Ethan pressed 2 fingers to her wrist, counting fast, too weak. "Heart," Henry said, voice breaking. "It's happening again." Ethan nodded once. "I know." Below them, a new sound cut through the chaos, the low, steady thrum of engines. Hope. From the gray chop beyond the collapsed span, a Coast Guard rescue boat surged into view, riding the violent swells with practiced defiance. It was a medium-sized response craft, orange hull battered and scarred from years of storms, crewed by 3 figures moving with urgent precision. At the helm stood Lieutenant Sarah McKenna, a woman in her late 30s, tall and powerfully built, her dark hair braided tight beneath her helmet. Her face was weathered by salt and wind, eyes sharp and unwavering. She had the posture of someone who trusted action more than words, someone shaped by too many nights where hesitation meant loss. "Visual on survivors," she shouted, voice cutting clean through the storm. "Hold position." Ethan wanted to laugh at the absurdity of the command. There was no position to hold. The boat maneuvered closer, fighting the current. A second rescuer, Tom Alvarez, shorter, stockier, with a graying beard and calm, methodical movements, clipped a line to his harness. The third, a young woman named Nina Park, lean and quick-eyed, prepared a stretcher with hands that moved faster than fear. "Dog first," Sarah called, spotting Bruno instantly. "He's going under." Ethan looked down. Bruno's head had sagged. His breathing was ragged now, each inhale a desperate effort. The dog's eyes flicked toward Ethan, once still alert, still present, but his body was failing him. "No," Ethan whispered. The rescue line dropped. Tom swung toward Bruno, timing his descent between waves, boots slamming into steel. He reached the dog, looping the line around Bruno's harness with practiced speed. Bruno resisted weakly, teeth snapping once in protest. Not fear, but refusal to leave. "It's okay," Ethan said hoarsely, gripping Bruno's neck. "You did your job." The dog's ears twitched. His body sagged as the line went taut and he was lifted, slowly, carefully, away from the hanging steel. Water washed over him one last time before the boat hauled him aboard. Ethan watched until Bruno was gone, Then the bridge shifted again. "Now!" Sarah shouted. The rescuers worked fast. Margaret was next, lifted with agonizing care as Nina guided her onto the stretcher, hands already checking vitals, oxygen mask pressed firmly over her mouth and nose. Henry followed, hauled aboard coughing, collapsing to his knees the moment his boots hit the deck. Ethan was last. As the line tightened around him, he felt the remaining steel beneath him tear free. The hanging structure dropped away entirely, vanishing into the sea just as he was yanked upward. For a breathless second, he dangled over open water, then he was slammed onto the boat's deck, rolling hard, gasping, alive. The world narrowed to sound and sensation, shouting, engines, wind. Bruno lay nearby, oxygen mask fitted over his muzzle, chest rising and falling in shallow, determined breaths. Tom knelt beside him, monitoring, one hand steady on the dog's shoulder. Margaret coughed weakly, color slowly returning to her face as Nina worked. Henry sat beside her, gripping her hand, tears cutting clean lines through the salt on his cheeks. Cameras appeared at the edge of the dock as the boat finally reached calmer water news crews who had arrived too late for the danger, but just in time for the story. Lights flashed. Voices called out. Ethan turned away. He sat hunched on the deck, staring at the empty horizon where the bridge had once stood, unable to watch as lenses tried to capture meaning from wreckage. Behind him, Bruno breathed. That was enough. Spring returned to the Oregon coast quietly, without apology. The ocean still breathed in long, patient rhythms, blue-gray under a sky that had learned how to soften again. Gulls circled above the harbor, their cries no longer drowned by sirens. Where Bayline Bridge had once torn itself apart, cranes now stood like tall, patient insects, lifting steel with careful precision. The new bridge rose slowly, deliberately, as if the town itself had decided not to rush anymore. They called it the Guardian Bridge. The name had come from a town meeting held in a weathered community hall that still smelled faintly of salt and old wood. It wasn't suggested by politicians or developers. It came from a woman who had lived on the coast for 70 years and had buried 2 fishermen husbands to storms that didn't care about names. This bridge stood because someone listened, she had said, so let it be named for that. Ethan Hale stood in the edge of the construction site now, hands in the pockets of his faded jacket, watching welders secure a final beam. He looked thinner than he had months ago, the kind of thinness that came from sleepless nights rather than hunger. His dark hair, once kept short and practical, had grown slightly unruly, curling at the edges when the sea wind touched it. Ethan was a quiet man by nature, tall but not imposing, with shoulders shaped by years of carrying responsibility rather than pride. His face bore the subtle marks of a life lived under pressure-fine lines around the eyes, a faint crease between his brows that never fully relaxed. People who didn't know him well sometimes mistook his reserve for coldness. Those who did knew better. Survival had shaped him, guilt had sharpened him, and now, slowly, something else was learning to live beside those things. Behind him, Bruno sat on the packed gravel, his posture calm and dignified, despite the slight stiffness that still lingered in his injured hind leg. The German shepherd was 7 years old now, his sable coat thick and well-groomed, the black saddle along his back catching the light. His eyes, amber and steady, tracked everything without urgency, the way experienced guardians did. Bruno no longer wore a working harness, just a simple collar, worn leather softened by time. A local paper had called him a hero with 4 paws. Bruno had responded to the attention by yawning and turning his head away from cameras, unimpressed. What mattered to him was simpler. Ethan was still there, and the world still needed watching. A few steps away, Henry and Margaret Collins stood together, fingers intertwined as naturally as breathing. Henry walked with a cane now, though he rarely leaned on it. He was in his early 70s, broad-shouldered even after age had thinned him, with hands still scarred from decades of welding steel and salt air. His white hair was cropped short, his face lined but alert, the eyes of a man who had spent his life looking at structures and asking whether they would hold. Margaret stood close to him, small but steady. Her silver hair was cut neatly at her jaw, her posture upright in the way of someone who had learned that fear did not excuse surrender. The faint weakness in her heart remained, but it no longer defined her. She wore a light blue scarf today, its color echoing the calm of the morning sea. They were volunteers now. Every Tuesday and Friday, Henry taught structural basics at the town's Coastal Emergency Preparedness Center, explaining plainly, honestly, how infrastructure failed when people stayed silent. Margaret worked with residents during tsunami drills, her voice calm, her presence grounding. She knew what panic felt like. That made her good at meeting it without judgment. The center itself was new, built on higher ground, equipped with upgraded seismic sensors and a modern tsunami early warning system. Towers now dotted the coastline, quiet sentinels measuring pressure, vibration, and retreating tides with relentless accuracy. The sirens had been recalibrated. They would never be late again. Ethan hadn't asked to be involved in any of it. That was part of why the town insisted. He now served as a coastal bridge safety consultant, a role offered not with ceremony, but with respect. He reviewed designs, questioned assumptions, and most importantly, had the authority to stop projects when something felt wrong. He used that authority carefully. He remembered too well what happened when no one did. At the dedication ceremony, there were speeches, there were plaques, there were cameras again. Ethan stood at the back, hands folded, uncomfortable but present. When the mayor gestured for him to come forward, he hesitated. Bruno nudged his leg once, firm and familiar. Ethan went. He didn't give a speech. He said one sentence. "Build things like someone's life depends on them," he said quietly. "Because it does." That was all. When it was Bruno's turn, the crowd laughed softly. The dog accepted the honorary K9 rescue medallion with dignified confusion, allowing it to be draped over his neck before shaking himself lightly, as if the weight offended his sense of balance. Children clapped. Cameras flashed. Bruno looked up at Ethan. That was enough ceremony for him. Later, when the crowd thinned and the tide shifted, the four of them stood at the overlook where the old bridge had once cast its shadow. The new Guardian Bridge stretched across the water, clean lines catching the sun. It looked stronger. It looked honest. The ocean moved beneath it, unchanged. Margaret broke the silence first. "It's strange," she said softly. "The sea looks exactly the same," Henry nodded, "but we don't." Ethan watched a small wave break against the rocks below. "The ocean was never the enemy," he said. "We just forgot to respect it." Bruno lay down at his feet, chin resting on his paws, eyes half-lidded but aware. Ethan reached down without thinking, resting a hand on the dog's broad neck. The warmth was real, solid, no longer borrowed time. Weeks earlier, Ethan had signed the adoption papers. Not a transfer, not a reassignment, a promise. He no longer thought of Bruno as equipment or duty or responsibility. He thought of him the way people thought of anchors, not as something that held you back, but as something that kept you from being swept away. The wind carried the smell of salt and pine. Somewhere in town, a siren was being tested, not in panic, but practice. Margaret smiled at the sound. "That one doesn't scare me anymore," she said. Henry squeezed her hand. Ethan looked out at the bridge, then down at Bruno. The sea was still there, but so were they, and this time they were listening. Spring returned to the Oregon coast quietly, without apology. The ocean still breathed in long, patient rhythms, blue-gray under a sky that had learned how to soften again. Gulls circled above the harbor, their cries no longer drowned by sirens. Where Bayline Bridge had once torn itself apart, cranes now stood like tall, patient insects, lifting steel with careful precision. The new bridge rose slowly, deliberately, as if the town itself had decided not to rush anymore. They called it the Guardian Bridge. The name had come from a town meeting held in a weathered community hall that still smelled faintly of salt and old wood. It wasn't suggested by politicians or developers. It came from a woman who had lived on the coast for 70 years and had buried 2 fishermen husbands to storms that didn't care about names. "This bridge stood because someone listened," she had said, "so let it be named for that."